I'm always surprised by how the Yakuza series is something of a sleeper hit here in the West. That's not to say that it isn't wildly successful, but I find it often gets overlooked when we talk about high-quality AAA games, something I'm personally guilty of. But I also kind of get it. The series is 6 or 7 games long at this point, they generally don't feature English voice work, and most of the games aren't on current systems, so being intimidated by the Yakuza franchise is totally understandable. But if you've ever looked at the series from the outside and wanted to get a taste, Judgment might just be the game for you. Judgment is a spin-off of sorts to the Yakuza franchise, but it also stands entirely on its own, with a unique story and cast of characters that simply utilizes certain elements from the Yakuza series, namely the majority of its mechanics and its primary setting, the ever-buzzing city known as Kamurocho. Judgment gives us a tension-filled crime drama that follows a disgraced lawyer-turned-detective, named Yagami, as he follows a string of murders resulting in a trail of Yakuza corpses with their eyes removed. Though the pacing can be thrown off occasionally by the constant introduction of side and subplots, the story of Judgment is absolutely gripping, throwing new twists and turns at players right up until the final chapter. It also follows a handful of genuinely captivating characters, such as the protagonist, Yagami, and his associate, Kaito, who are overflowing with charm. Though not every character is quite as fun to be around as our core duo, you'd be hard-pressed to find one that isn't at least somewhat interesting over the course of the entire game. Now, a big part of what makes these characters so interesting are the performances that bring them to life, and these folks absolutely killed it. Now, this being a Yakuza spin-off, it only felt right to play it with the subtitles and the Japanese VO, and for folks of a similar mind, you won't be disappointed. Even if you don't speak the language, the actors deliver on tone and emotion in spades, and the subtitles are still my favourite example of localization to date, much like the main series Yakuza games. Alternatively, if you're one of the folks that's always turned off by the Yakuza series' lack of English VO, then you won't be missing out with Judgment. The lip syncing is noticeably off on occasion, but not so badly that it distracts from the excellent English performances. In fact, I think I love English Kaito, as voiced by Crispin Freeman, just a tiny bit more than Japanese Kaito. He's just that little bit more boisterous, which is kinda perfect for a game like this. So what kind of game is Judgment? Well, it's an open-world action-adventure game, just like the Yakuza games. That might be selling it a little bit short, since Judgment does feature a handful of mechanics that are unique to it, on top of the core Yakuza-style combat. But the majority of the game is spent smacking down thugs in the streets of Kamurocho, and the combat is remarkably Yakuza-like. You're usually up against a handful of enemies and have to employ fairly basic light and heavy attacks and grapples to dispatch them. It's not an overly deep system beyond giving you 2 fighting styles based on taking on solo targets or entire groups, but it is fairly satisfying to send thugs flying all over the streets. And I'd be lying if I said that I got tired of the various EX finishing moves by the time the game ended. They're so ludicrous and painful looking that I was always super entertained when a new one would just happen out of nowhere. I will say that the inclusion of wall jump moves, as well as the ability to sprint during combat, are appreciated, otherwise the combat can become a bit repetitive. It is cool that combat flows naturally from open world exploration as well, rather than being dovetailed by an opening cutscene and a score screen when you finish like the combat was in Yakuza 0. It just makes it flow a little bit better, I think. Other than a handful of tiny details though, Judgment's most prominent gameplay element is practically lifted from the Yakuza series, which is fine, but might become a bit tedious if you've only recently come from a Yakuza game. To the game's credit, there are a handful of mechanics that do set Judgment apart, though they aren't quite as compelling as the narrative or combat. As a detective, Yagami often has to investigate crime scenes for evidence, tail suspects, or in extreme circumstances chase suspects down, and there are mechanics to reflect all of these elements. Investigation sequences are frustratingly straightforward, as they place you in these super small zones before tasking you with finding 3 or 4 particular elements, or a person or detail that fits a certain description. These moments slow the game down and you're literally unable to miss evidence. There's no way you can fail these. You can't move forward until every box is ticked. This rigidity is maybe my least favorite aspect of the game, since in a narrative that requires you to solve a mystery, not being able to solve it feels like a necessary risk. And at no point in Judgment does it feel like you might mess up the investigation unless the game requires you to. When it comes to allowing failure, the game does occasionally let you question suspects or key witnesses, but the only benefit you gain from asking the correct questions are negligible XP rewards, and there's no punishment for asking the wrong questions. I also found that the tailing and chase sequences fell pretty short as well. They aren't necessarily bad, but they don't require any great effort to complete either. Tailing a suspect can drag on and on as your mark wanders through Kamurocho at a leisurely pace, forcing you to hide behind random environmental elements whenever they turn around, and chase sequences, though thankfully much faster and more engaging, simply task you with nailing quick-time events to bypass obstacles. At best, there just isn't a lot to say about these aspects of the game, and at worst, in the case of the tailing missions, they grind the game's momentum to an absolute halt. Now, the same could be said of Judgment's copious amounts of side content, but in defense of the side content, you do have to opt into most of it. Not all of it, mind you. It's not uncommon for the main story to veer off into side content at times, and whenever the main plot did send me on a detour into side content town, I definitely found myself counting the minutes until things got back on track. That said, for the most part, I found the game's side content to be pretty consistently entertaining. It doesn't usually offer up different types of gameplay unless you're specifically engaging with the various minigames in Kamurocho, but the stories it delivers via more combat, tailing, chasing, and investigation sequences are generally worthwhile. Judgment is one of the few games I can think of that has no problem getting dark and emotional in its main plot, before sending you chasing after a pervert who is named, and I can't stress how serious I am about this, Ass Ketchum. What I'm trying to say is that there's a ton of unique and often bizarre side content to sink your teeth into, and despite the relatively small size of Kamurocho, Judgment is a super dense, fairly long game, making the high quality of its side stories even more surprising. With all that said, Judgment is good. It doesn't bring a ton of new and interesting ideas to the table in terms of gameplay. In fact, I'd say that the mechanics that separate it from the Yakuza franchise are more detrimental than not, but it is still a fairly enjoyable time. The writing and performances are top notch, the plot will keep you guessing right up until the closing hours, while the combat is really satisfying, if a tad simple. If you've always wanted to get into the Yakuza games but have been intimidated by the series' length, or you love the Yakuza games and want something just a tiny bit different, Judgment might be right up your alley. Hell, if you're looking for a solid crime drama and a mystery to solve, Judgment is fantastic.